Betrayal is a funny thing if you can even call it that. It doesn't hit you over the head all at once. No, it sneaks in slow and quiet, settling down where you can barely see it until it's staring you right in the face. It all started with a smell. A single, ridiculous thing to notice, but that's where it began. Claire had been working late for weeks, saying it was some big project, something her team just couldn't finish on time. She'd come home tired, almost like she was sleepwalking, grabbing a snack from the fridge and heading straight upstairs. I felt bad for her, so I never pressed her to talk about it much, just asked here and there how things were going, if her boss was treating her fair. She'd sigh, tell me everything was fine, and that was that. And honestly, I never thought I had a reason to doubt her. We'd been together for nearly 10 years, weathered ups and downs, and I thought she was solid. One night, though, it changed. It was a Thursday. I'd been making dinner, something quick. Pasta, garlic bread, a salad because she'd been trying to eat healthier, and when she came through the door, she looked worn out. I went to hug her, maybe just to make her feel like she could let go of the stress. And that's when I caught it. A sharp, woodsy scent, a cologne that definitely wasn't mine. The smell was faint but strong enough to be noticeable. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore it either. So I mentioned it, tried to keep it light, even laughed a little as I asked, "Hey, who've you been hanging out with?" Without missing a beat, she brushed it off, saying her boss, Mark, had been helping her carry some things to her car, and maybe his cologne rubbed off. She even chuckled, gave me this little shoulder squeeze like she thought I'd buy it and forget the whole thing. And for a second, I almost did. But there was something about the way she said it, so casual, too quick, like she already had it rehearsed. I noticed she wouldn't quite meet my eyes either, just kept messing with the strap on her purse like she was already thinking of something else. I didn't push it right then. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially if there was a reasonable explanation. But once that idea was in my head, it grew roots. I started noticing little things, stuff I might have ignored before. She'd be on her phone a lot, more than I'd ever seen her. She'd sit on the couch, laughing quietly at messages, but if I asked what was funny, she'd just wave me off with a, "Oh, nothing, just work stuff." Then she'd angle her phone away or set it face down beside her. Normally, I wouldn't have cared. I mean, everyone texts a lot nowadays, right? But it was more than just the phone. There was this weird distance between us, like she was always distracted. At dinner, I'd try to ask about her day, just making conversation, and her responses would be short, like she was just humoring me. It was fine. Nothing special. Mark's driving everyone crazy. That was about all I got. Then, one night, I found her wedding ring lying on the bathroom counter. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but it threw me. Claire never took off her ring. Not even in the shower. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the little engravings we'd had done on the inside. Forever and always. The words felt heavier than usual. I waited, trying to see if she'd say something about it, maybe explain why she took it off. But she didn't. She just came into the room, glanced at it in my hand, and looked almost annoyed that I was holding it. She grabbed it from me, muttered something about forgetting it after she'd washed her hands, and went back to her phone. Maybe all of these things were small on their own. But together? They were painting a picture, one I didn't want to look at too closely, but I couldn't ignore it. I didn't want to be that guy, suspicious and untrusting. But I knew I had to see it for myself. That night, lying in bed next to Claire, I kept staring at the ceiling, feeling this tension, a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. She was right beside me, scrolling on her phone, the light from the screen casting shadows on her face. It was like she was right there, but miles away. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling sat heavy, making my stomach churn. The next day, I decided to pay attention, really pay attention, to what she was doing. For the first time in our marriage, I started watching her every move, trying to see if my gut feeling was wrong. I hated myself for it, honestly, but I needed to know. She got up early that morning, saying she'd be gone all day for work and would probably grab dinner with her team before heading home. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me, but I was tense. As she grabbed her things, I noticed how carefully she'd picked her outfit. She didn't always wear makeup to work, but that day she'd spent time in front of the mirror, fixing her hair just right, putting on a shade of lipstick that I hadn't seen her wear in ages. "Big day at the office?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced at me in the mirror, shrugging as she brushed a strand of hair out of her face. Just want to look professional, that's all. Mark says first impressions count, especially with the higher-ups in town. She said it like it was the most normal thing, but there was that same glimmer in her eyes that I'd noticed before, a hint of something she was holding back. I watched her leave, fighting the urge to follow her right then and there, but I knew I'd be acting crazy. Still, it was hard to ignore how my mind kept circling back to the smell of that cologne, the way she'd angled her phone away from me, that wedding ring lying forgotten on the counter. All those little things, they kept whispering to me, telling me something wasn't right. I spent the day in a haze, barely able to focus at work. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that maybe she really was just busy with work. But then, right around 7:30 that evening, I got a notification on my phone, a ping from our home security app. Normally, it didn't alert me unless someone was at the door, so I checked it right away, hoping maybe she'd come home early. But it wasn't her. The app showed an unfamiliar car parked in our driveway, a black sedan, shiny and spotless, the kind of car you'd expect someone like Mark to drive. I felt my heart hammering as I watched the screen. I waited for Claire to step out, but nothing happened. The car just sat there, engine running, the lights cutting through the evening shadows. After a few minutes, I saw her come out, laughing as she got into the passenger seat. And just like that, they drove off. I couldn't believe it. There she was, all dressed up, getting into another man's car, not a care in the world. I stared at the footage, my jaw clenched, feeling my stomach drop like a stone. The rest of the night was a blur. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind off what I'd just seen. But nothing worked. I kept picturing them together, seeing her laughing, looking happier than she had around me in months. I couldn't confront her yet, though. I knew I needed more. Something that couldn't be brushed off as just a work dinner. So I sat there, steeling myself, making a plan in my mind. I was going to catch her in the act, even if it broke me to do it. That next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. I decided I was going to wait for the right moment and catch her red-handed, no more guessing or second-guessing myself. I wanted the truth laid out in front of me, undeniable and clear. Over the next few days, I went through the motions, pretending everything was normal. If Claire noticed anything different in me, she didn't say. She'd leave in the morning wearing those carefully chosen outfits, her makeup just right, and she'd come back late, always with an excuse ready. It was a working dinner, or Mark asked me to stay behind to finish the reports. Once or twice, I asked her how things were going at work, just to see her reaction. Busy, she'd say, without much detail, her eyes focused on something else, like her mind was a million miles away. The distance between us was getting wider, and I could feel it every time I looked at her. Then one evening, she came home without her wedding ring again. This time, it wasn't lying on the bathroom counter. It was nowhere to be found. I looked around, trying to act casual as I went through her things, but it just wasn't there. I didn't say anything, though. I wanted her to think I hadn't noticed. I kept quiet, letting her believe she was in the clear. But I was getting close to having enough. I could feel it. Every time I caught her in a little lie, it only pushed me closer to the edge. Then Friday came, and I saw my chance. I told her I'd be working late, covering for a colleague. Might be out till midnight, I said, careful to keep my voice even. She nodded, barely looking up from her phone. All right, take care, she said, the way you'd say goodbye to a stranger. It was like I didn't exist. I left the house, driving around aimlessly for a while, the tension building up inside me. But I wasn't about to let it get the best of me. I circled back and parked a few blocks away from home, hidden but close enough to keep an eye on things. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, watching the minutes crawl by. Finally, after about an hour, I saw headlights down the street. A car pulled up to our driveway, a familiar black sedan. Mark's car. The sight of it sent a rush of anger through me, but I stayed still, forcing myself to breathe, to wait. I watched as Claire stepped out, her face bright, a smile on her lips that I hadn't seen in ages. She looked at Mark, said something I couldn't hear, and then took his hand as they walked to the door. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling my knuckles turn white. They disappeared inside, the door shutting behind them like a punch to the gut. I sat there in silence, the reality of it crashing down on me. She wasn't just distracted or stressed from work. She wasn't just in some rough patch. She was with him, right there in our house, crossing lines I thought she'd never even get close to. Hours passed. I didn't know how I stayed out there that long, but I did. I needed to feel the full weight of it. Needed it to sink in, because once it did, there was no going back. Finally, just before midnight, I saw the lights inside flicker off. A few minutes later, Mark came out, looking over his shoulder before walking briskly back to his car. He drove off without a second glance. Only then did I pull myself together enough to leave. I didn't go home that night. I needed to get away, to think, to breathe. The next day, when I walked back through the door, I acted like nothing was wrong. Claire greeted me with a quick, "Good morning," barely meeting my eyes, but I could feel the guilt lurking under her calm facade. She didn't ask why I hadn't come home last night, didn't question where I'd been. She just carried on, like I was another detail she could ignore. And right then I knew. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she felt the weight of what she'd done. That next week, something shifted inside me. I'd seen enough, felt enough, and I was done just sitting around, letting her lies pile up. I'd read enough stories of guys who confronted their wives too soon, only to have them deny everything, twist it, somehow make themselves the victims. No, I needed a different plan, something that would make her, and Mark, feel the consequences of what they'd done. I started paying closer attention to everything. Claire's routines, her habits, the little things she probably didn't even realize she did differently now. Every time she laughed at a text and quickly tucked her phone away, every time she disappeared for a work thing, it just fueled me. It made my decision feel right. A plan started forming in my mind, and I began setting things up, piece by piece. See, Mark wasn't just some random guy. He was her boss, and from what I knew, he was a real stickler for order and appearances. Claire had told me once how he was obsessive about keeping his office spotless. She'd laughed about it, saying he'd get irritated if a single pen was out of place on his desk. He was the type of guy who'd double-check everything to maintain his pristine image. I used that. Over the next couple of weeks, I put on a good act. Smiling, laughing at her jokes, asking her how her day was as if everything was fine. I wanted her comfortable, wanted her to believe she had me completely fooled. I could see her relaxing bit by bit, easing back into our life together, probably thinking she'd gotten away with it. But meanwhile, I was preparing. Every time she left for one of her so-called meetings, I made a little more progress. I reached out to some tech-savvy friends, people who knew their way around security devices. I ordered a few things, small and undetectable, and started practicing how to set them up. I even tried hiding them around our own house to make sure they wouldn't be spotted. One evening, after she'd gone to bed, I went over my plan in my mind, double-checking every detail. I wasn't going to confront her directly. No, that was too easy. I wanted her and Mark to pay, to feel the weight of their actions in every area of their lives, especially at work. The next morning, I took the day off work and drove to Mark's office building. I'd done my research, learned his assistant's schedule, and knew when she'd be away from her desk. I walked in with a few urgent documents in hand, looking as professional as I could, and managed to convince the temporary receptionist that I just needed 5 minutes in his office to drop them off. She barely questioned me and let me in, probably assuming I was part of some company they worked with. Once inside, I got to work. I took out the tiny recording devices and hid them in places he'd never think to check, behind his framed awards, under the edge of his desk, even inside the lid of his stapler. I kept it subtle, careful, leaving no trace. Finally, I sprayed a faint mist of Claire's perfume in the air, something she wore often. It wouldn't be enough to notice right away, but after a while, that scent would linger just enough to make people wonder. Then, before leaving, I pulled out the final piece, a doctored recording I'd created, one that made it sound like Mark had been talking to someone about personal matters. Explicit enough to be suspicious, but subtle enough that it wouldn't sound immediately fake. I planted it carefully, knowing that sooner or later, someone would stumble across it. When I left that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Satisfaction. The days after that were almost too easy. I went back to my usual routine, playing the part of the oblivious husband, but inside, I was just waiting for the pieces to fall into place. Every time Claire left the house, saying she had a meeting or late work session, I smiled, kissed her goodbye, and watched her drive off. She seemed more relaxed than ever, like she'd finally let down her guard. That only made it easier for me to stay calm. A week or so later, I could tell something had shifted. Claire came home one night looking rattled. She walked in, set her bag down, and for the first time in weeks, she looked at me, really looked at me. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, almost concerned. She hesitated, then forced a quick smile. "Yeah, fine. Just a rough day. Work stuff, you know." She looked away just as quickly, moving past me to grab a glass of water. I watched her, feeling a small surge of satisfaction as she downed it, staring off into space, clearly lost in thought. I figured it was only a matter of time before the setup in Mark's office would start to take its toll. A couple more days went by, and that's when things really started to get interesting. I heard through the grapevine, one of Claire's co-workers, an old friend of mine, texted me a casual, "Hey, what's up with Claire's boss?" Apparently, Mark's office had been searched. Rumors were already spreading that there'd been a police investigation, and people were whispering about possible illegal activities happening right under their noses. The co-worker had no idea what it was about, but I could feel his curiosity, and maybe a bit of suspicion, just from the way he phrased it. That same night, Claire was jumpy, checking her phone every few minutes, barely eating her dinner. She tried to make small talk, but I could see she was distracted. Every time her phone buzzed, she glanced at me nervously, then quickly typed out a reply. I kept my own phone tucked away, pretending I was oblivious. Then, as she was clearing the plates, her phone rang. She looked at me, then turned her back, lowering her voice as she answered. I only caught snippets, but it was enough. "Yes, I know. No, he hasn't said anything. Of course, I'll handle it. Just calm down, Mark." Hearing his name out loud, her whisper as tense as I'd ever heard, was enough to confirm it. She and Mark were rattled. They knew something was going down, but they had no idea how far it was going to go. I took a sip of my water, hiding my smirk, acting as if I hadn't heard a word. After that phone call, Claire was a wreck. She tried to act normal, but I could see the cracks forming. She was constantly on edge, checking her phone every few minutes, pacing around the house, looking like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She hardly even looked me in the eyes. A few days later, I found her in the living room, furiously typing out a text, her face pale and tense. I casually walked in, pretending I was looking for something, and she jolted like she'd seen a ghost. "Everything okay?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, just work's a little crazy right now," she mumbled, trying to smile but failing miserably. She quickly shoved her phone into her pocket and looked around, as if trying to think of something else to say. "Anything I can help with?" I offered, keeping my tone light, but I could see her squirm at the question. "No, it's just, you know how things get at work sometimes." "It'll pass," she said, looking away. Her hands were fidgeting, twisting her wedding ring, the same ring that had mysteriously disappeared a few weeks back and now seemed like a dead weight on her finger. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, though inside I could feel my anger and satisfaction simmering together. I didn't need her to tell me. I knew she and Mark were in full panic mode. My plan was working exactly as I'd hoped. Then, the tipping point hit. It was 2 weeks after I'd planted everything, and I was finishing up a late shift at work when I got a message from my friend in Claire's office. "Dude, your wife's boss just got hauled out of here by the cops. Everyone's saying it's some kind of corporate espionage." I could practically hear the chaos through that text. Mark, the perfectionist, the well-respected untouchable manager, was now under a full-blown investigation. They'd found the recordings I'd planted, ones I'd carefully doctored to sound like he was sharing confidential information, like he was hiding some big secrets. It was enough to send the whole office into a frenzy, and with the police involved, Mark's perfect image was crumbling fast. That night, Claire came home looking like she'd been through a war. She was quiet, hardly spoke a word to me, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. She went straight upstairs, saying she needed a shower, and didn't come back down for hours. When she finally did, she was holding her phone like it was a lifeline, staring down at the screen with this blank, almost numb expression. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone innocent, like I hadn't heard a thing. She nodded slowly, barely registering my question. "Yeah, it's been a lot." I could tell she wanted to talk, wanted to say something, but she held back, like she was scared to even let the truth slip. So I let it hang in the air, watching her spiral, watching her struggle to keep her head above water. I knew this was just the beginning. By now, Claire was unraveling faster than I'd expected. Every day after work, she came home a little more frazzled, her eyes darting around like she expected something terrible to happen at any moment. She'd barely eat, spent most evenings on the phone or checking her messages, her fingers shaking as she typed. She was constantly making excuses to leave the house, her errands and work meetings becoming more frequent, always with a new level of urgency. One evening, she came in looking paler than ever. She dropped her bag by the door and just stared at the floor, like she didn't even have the energy to pretend anymore. "Is everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible, though I already knew the answer. I could see the dread in her eyes, that trapped look, like a cornered animal. She hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "Things at work. They're bad," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, anything you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my face calm even though I could feel my pulse quicken. It was strange, the satisfaction and anger swirling together in me, like I was watching the truth unfold in slow motion. She glanced at me, then looked away. "No, it's just, Mark, they're accusing him of some pretty serious stuff. Corporate theft, misuse of company property. They found all these recordings in his office. He's under investigation." Her voice cracked a little, and I could tell she was struggling to keep her composure. She took a seat on the couch, putting her face in her hands. I sat down beside her, keeping my tone gentle. "Wow, that sounds intense. I'm sure it must be tough to work in that kind of environment." Yeah, it's more than tough." She looked at me, her eyes glassy. "They think someone's been spying on the company from the inside, recording things without permission. And I don't know what's going to happen to all of us if it doesn't get resolved." I almost wanted to laugh, the irony hitting me harder than ever. But I just nodded, watching her try to hold herself together. "I'm sure it'll all blow over," I said, trying to sound comforting. "If there's one thing about corporate types, it's that they don't like scandals." She looked away again, and I could see the fear etched on her face. She knew this wasn't going to blow over. And she also knew she couldn't just up and leave, it was too late for that. She was tied to this sinking ship, whether she liked it or not. The following week, the tension only got worse. I heard from a friend in the office that Mark had been officially put on leave, pending a full investigation, and that the higher-ups were scrambling to do damage control. People were being called in for questioning, files were getting combed through, and no one could figure out how those recordings had even ended up in Mark's office. One night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard Claire on the phone, whispering urgently. "No, Mark, I don't know how they found out. I don't know." "Yes, I'll keep quiet, I promise. Just don't call me at home anymore, okay? It's too risky." She hung up, sat there in the dark for a while, and I heard a quiet sob escape her. The woman who used to laugh and smile beside me was falling apart piece by piece, and honestly, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. Because this was just the beginning. Claire was running on fumes. Her face had taken on this hollow look, like she hadn't slept in days. She'd go to work looking almost sick, only to come back home barely saying a word, just heading straight to bed. Every so often, I'd catch her staring at nothing, eyes glazed over with worry and guilt. It was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality. And I knew that every glance, every whispered phone call, was just her sinking deeper. About 2 weeks into this, her phone buzzed late one night. She was already in bed, so when she heard it, she tensed up, her eyes darting toward me. I pretended to be dozing, listening as she grabbed her phone, took a quick look at the screen, and slipped out of the room. I waited a few minutes, then quietly followed, stopping at the edge of the hallway. She was in the kitchen, phone to her ear, her voice low and panicked. "I know, Mark, I know. I don't know what they want from me. They're asking questions about everyone, especially you." "Yes, I'm keeping quiet. I wouldn't say a word." She let out a shaky breath. I'm scared they're going to come after me too." Hearing her talk like that, the fear in her voice, almost made me feel something. Almost. But then I remembered her slipping off with him, laughing, spending hours with him in my house, in my bed, and whatever sympathy I felt quickly faded. As she hung up, I slipped back to bed, settling into the covers just as she crept back in. She slipped in beside me, barely a whisper of movement, but I could feel the tension in her. Lying there, it hit me how much everything had changed between us, and not just because of her affair. I used to feel so connected to her, like we were a team. Now, all I felt was a quiet satisfaction that I was finally seeing her true colors. The next morning, over breakfast, she barely touched her food, pushing her eggs around on her plate. I waited a beat before speaking. "You seem a little tense, Claire. Something wrong?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just a lot of work stress, that's all. Mark's situation. It's been a lot for everyone." I nodded, watching her, keeping my tone neutral. "Well, if there's anything I can do, let me know. Maybe a weekend trip? Get your mind off things." She gave me a weak smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe, just not right now. Work's too crazy." I watched as she finished her coffee and quickly left, barely glancing back. She probably thought she was holding it all together, but I could see her cracking, the weight of the situation finally hitting her. And that was exactly what I wanted. Later that day, I got a message from my friend in her office. "Mark's out. Officially fired. They're saying he's under a full investigation. Might even get criminal charges." I read the text twice, feeling a grim satisfaction settle in. That evening, Claire came home later than usual. She walked through the door, looking pale and shaken, her shoulders slumped in a way I hadn't seen before. Without a word, she sank down onto the couch, her head in her hands. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could. She just nodded, her voice barely a whisper. They fired Mark today. There's talk of charges, like he might actually go to jail." Her hands were shaking, her eyes wide, like she was finally understanding the depth of what was happening. I sat beside her, nodding sympathetically. "Wow, that sounds intense. But I'm sure it'll work out. If he didn't do anything wrong, I mean." She flinched, glancing away. Yeah, I'm sure." But there was no confidence in her voice, no conviction, just pure, raw fear. And I could tell. She was finally starting to wonder if all of this was somehow connected to her, too. After Mark's firing, Claire was like a ghost around the house. She moved through each day in a haze, always on edge, flinching at every unexpected sound or message on her phone. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were clipped and cautious, like she was afraid she'd say too much. One night, as she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, staring blankly at her screen, I sat down across from her, letting the silence settle. I could see her jaw tighten as I took my seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the laptop. "Anything on your mind?" I asked, pretending to be curious, maybe even concerned. She hesitated, looking up at me like she wanted to say something. "Just thinking about work," she said slowly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's been a lot, with everything going on." I kept my expression neutral, like I didn't already know. "You know, you can talk to me. If there's something you're worried about, anything you need to get off your chest." She looked away, her fingers tapping faster on the edge of the laptop. It's fine, really. Just stressful." Her tone was defensive, but there was a tremor there, something she was barely holding back. I leaned back, watching her, trying to keep my voice soft. "Look, Claire, I know things have been rough lately. If there's anything you want to say, anything at all, you know I'm here." She looked at me, a flash of something vulnerable in her eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by a guarded, wary expression. She forced a smile, her fingers still tapping that frantic rhythm. "Thanks, but I'll be fine. I just need to get through this." "Of course," I said, keeping my tone light. "Just thought I'd offer." She nodded, her eyes back on the screen, the conversation closed. I knew she wasn't going to open up to me. Not yet, anyway. Whatever guilt she felt, she was still holding on to it, still trying to pretend it wasn't there. The days went on, each one thick with tension. It was almost like we were both waiting for something to happen, for the next shoe to drop. Claire was still talking to Mark, quietly, late at night, when she thought I was asleep. Each time, her voice was more panicked, more desperate, as she tried to reassure him, to tell him everything would be fine. But she didn't believe it, and neither did I. Then one evening, as she was putting her phone away, I noticed her fingers shaking again, this time more violently than usual. She looked at me for a moment, and for a second, I thought she was going to say something. But then she clamped her mouth shut, forcing a tight smile, and went upstairs. She was unraveling, slowly, but surely. And I knew the moment of reckoning was getting closer. As the days passed, Claire's life continued to unravel, and with each passing hour, it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. She barely ate, her face looked pale and hollow, and the dark circles under her eyes were proof that she wasn't sleeping much either. At night, I'd hear her pacing around the house or quietly talking on her phone, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. She was desperately trying to control a situation that was way beyond her grasp. Then, one morning, I noticed she left her phone on the kitchen counter when she went to shower. Normally, she kept it glued to her hand, so this was rare, like fate handing me a gift. I knew I only had a few minutes, so I grabbed it and quickly went through her messages. There, under her recent calls, was a series of messages from Mark. The last one read, "We need to talk. They're investigating everyone. Don't answer at work." I stared at that message, feeling a strange, bitter satisfaction. Mark was panicking too. All the careful order he'd maintained in his life was crumbling, and now he was grasping at straws. I quickly scrolled through the rest, finding message after message of Mark's desperation, his anger at being caught off guard, his worry that Claire might spill everything. There were even texts where he hinted that if things went south, he might have to cut her loose to protect himself. It was almost laughable. Here was the man she'd thrown our marriage away for, and now he was ready to abandon her to save his own skin. I locked her phone and put it back just as I heard the water turn off upstairs. When she came down a few minutes later, her face scrubbed clean and her hair pulled back, she looked at me with that strained, exhausted smile she'd perfected lately. "Morning," she mumbled, grabbing her phone without meeting my eyes. She was tense, like she knew something terrible was coming but couldn't face it. I watched her, feeling a mix of anger and pity, wondering if she even realized the full extent of the mess she'd created. "You all right?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, almost casual. She gave a quick nod, but her hands were trembling as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Just tired," she muttered, taking a long sip and staring out the window. "It's been a lot, with everything going on." I nodded slowly. "I can imagine. But, you don't have to go through all this alone." She looked at me then, her face a mixture of guilt and weariness, like she was carrying the weight of every lie she'd told, every betrayal she'd tried to bury. "Thanks," she said, her voice so small it was almost a whisper. "But it's complicated." Complicated. That was one way to put it. But the way I saw it, the time for complications was over. Soon, everything was going to come out, and there'd be nowhere left for her to hide. As she left the house, I sat there, finishing my coffee, feeling the anticipation building up inside me. She thought she could keep pretending, keep acting like things would magically get better. But sooner or later, the truth was going to tear her world apart. And all I had to do was sit back and wait. After that morning, it was clear. Claire was nearing her breaking point. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd tense up, her eyes darting to me, as if expecting me to say something, to ask her who was calling. It was like she was expecting the truth to come out at any second, and that constant dread had her walking around on edge, ready to snap. The next day, she came home early from work, something she hadn't done in ages. She looked rattled, her hands shaking as she set her bag down on the counter, her face pale and drawn. I didn't ask why she was home early. Instead, I watched her carefully as she moved around the kitchen, pretending to sort through some mail but clearly just trying to look busy. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes red and tired. "They called me in today. HR," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh," I replied, feigning surprise. "What did they want to talk about?" She swallowed hard, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her bag. "They asked me questions. About Mark, about our department. They were vague, but I could tell. They know something's up." She paused, biting her lip. I think they might be onto him." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "I'm sure if you've got nothing to hide, you'll be fine," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Just answer honestly." Her face fell at that, and for a second, I thought she might break, might finally tell me what she'd been hiding. But she quickly recovered, putting on a strained smile. Of course. Honesty. Yeah. She went to the living room, sinking into the couch, staring at nothing in particular. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, her fear growing, the realization sinking in that this wasn't going away. She sat there for hours, lost in thought, while I went about my evening, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. The next few days, she seemed to shrink further into herself, moving around the house like a ghost, hardly saying a word. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd jump, her eyes flashing with panic before she'd quickly shut off the screen. She was slipping, holding on by a thread, and that thread was fraying fast. And then, 2 days later, it happened. I was at work when I got a text from my friend at her office. HR pulled Claire in again. They're asking everyone about her and Mark. People are starting to talk. It was exactly what I'd been waiting for. The rumors, the whispers, the shame. It was all coming down on her now. She was going to feel the weight of every lie, every betrayal, and it would be impossible to hide from. Mark was about to become her undoing, and everyone would know. When I got home that evening, I found Claire sitting at the dining table, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the glass of water in front of her. She didn't look up as I came in, didn't even acknowledge me. She was so far gone in her own thoughts that she barely noticed anything around her. I took my time putting my things away, watching her from the corner of my eye. She looked defeated, like someone who'd been wrung out and left to dry. I poured myself a drink and finally sat across from her, letting the silence sit heavy between us. After a while she looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Claire, the one I thought I'd married. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the haunted, fearful look she'd been carrying around for weeks. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice small and broken. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, almost casual, like this was just another conversation. She hesitated, her hands clenching around the glass. "Mark's. He's in trouble. Big trouble. And now they're questioning everyone who worked with him. I don't know what they're going to find." She sounded like she was talking to herself more than to me, as if she needed to hear the words out loud to make sense of them. But I didn't let up. "Well, did you do anything wrong?" I asked, watching her carefully. She flinched, looking down at her hands. No, I don't think so. But they're asking questions, really digging, and I don't know what they're looking for." Her voice shook, the cracks in her calm demeanor showing. "Claire," I said slowly, leaning in, "if you're innocent, you don't have anything to worry about. Just be honest." She stared at me, her eyes wide, and I could see the fear there, the guilt that she couldn't keep hidden. She looked like she was about to say something, maybe even confess, but then she just shook her head, her expression hardening. "I know. You're right. I'll handle it." But her tone was hollow, empty. She was trying to convince herself, but it was obvious she didn't believe her own words. I didn't say anything else, just watched her as she sat there, her face pale, her eyes darting to the door every time she heard a sound. It was like she expected someone to show up any second with a final nail for her coffin. And honestly, maybe that wasn't too far off. By the time she went to bed that night, she looked completely drained, like a shadow of the woman she used to be. She climbed under the covers, barely glancing at me, and turned away, curling up on her side. I lay there beside her, listening to her breathing, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I knew the worst was still to come. All the questions, the investigations. It was going to catch up with her, sooner than she realized. And when it did, she'd finally have to face the truth. The next morning, Claire looked even worse. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she poured herself a coffee. She didn't say anything to me, just stared into her cup like she was hoping it might offer her some answers. I wanted to ask how she slept, but I could tell she hadn't. She was running on fumes, barely holding herself together. As she was getting ready to leave, I casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I've got to take care of some things around the house today. I'll be working from home." Her hand froze on the door handle, her face shifting as she looked back at me. There was a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice thin and strained. "Of course," I said easily, shrugging. "Just thought I'd take it easy today." She nodded slowly, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "All right. Well, I'll see you tonight." She hesitated, like she wanted to say something more, but instead, she just turned and left. As soon as the door closed, I moved to set my plan into motion. I waited a while, let her get to work and settle in, then went to the computer, accessing the home security app. I pulled up the footage from the night she'd let Mark into our house, the night I'd watched her betray me in the most personal way possible. I hadn't looked at the footage since that night, but now, with a steady hand, I saved it to a drive, my anger numb and distant. Then I gathered other pieces of evidence I'd collected over the past month. The texts I'd taken screenshots of, the messages she'd hidden, the photos from the times I'd seen her sneaking around. I could feel the weight of it as I put everything together. Every lie, every betrayal, documented and ready to be laid bare. I packed up the drive, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it. As I stared at it, I knew what I had to do next. Mark's bosses needed to know everything, not just the espionage they were investigating, but the reasons behind his downfall, the people he'd dragged down with him. That afternoon, I drove to her office. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I went to the mailing center nearby and addressed the envelope to her company's HR department. Attention to the head of the investigation team. The evidence was all there, with clear instructions to look into Claire's involvement with Mark. I added a final note at the end, signed anonymously, making it clear that her affair hadn't just been personal. It had led to the unethical actions that had spiraled out of control in their department. As I dropped the envelope off, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was it. She was about to see what betrayal truly cost. Later that night, Claire came home, quieter than ever. I watched her move around the house, looking tense, probably sensing that things were finally slipping out of her control. She sat across from me at dinner, picking at her food, her eyes flickering with anxiety. She didn't know what was coming, but soon enough she'd understand. And when the truth hit, there'd be no running from it. The next few days, Claire moved around like a person waiting for an execution date. She'd barely talk, only muttering short answers when I tried to make small talk, her face growing more strained with each passing day. I knew she must have sensed something closing in on her, though she had no idea what or when. Then, one morning it happened. She got a call just as we were finishing breakfast. Her phone buzzed, and she looked down, her expression immediately turning wary. "Excuse me," she mumbled, standing up and moving to the other room. I heard her voice, low at first, but then rising, each word sharper than the last. "What do you mean an investigation?" "No, I don't know anything about that. Of course, I'll cooperate. Yes, I'll be there right away." When she came back into the kitchen, her face was ghostly pale. Her hands were shaking as she picked up her things, barely able to meet my eyes. "I have to go," she said, her voice tight. "Work. They need me to come in for a meeting." "Hope everything's okay," I said, keeping my tone casual, though the look in her eyes told me she knew it wasn't. She nodded absently, already half out the door. I watched her leave, letting myself relax only once she was gone. I knew what was waiting for her at that office, a truth she couldn't deny, a confrontation she couldn't talk her way out of. I spent that day at home, my mind drifting to what might be happening in that building. I pictured her sitting across from the HR team, her face crumbling as they laid out the evidence, each piece connecting her to Mark, to his betrayal of the company. There was no telling how she'd react, but I knew that whatever happened, there was no coming back from this. That evening, Claire came home late. She walked through the door slowly, her face drawn and haunted, like she'd just lived through a nightmare. She set her bag down on the table, her shoulders slumping. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at the floor. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes brimming with anger and something else, something like shame. They're saying I was involved in Mark's mess," she said, her voice trembling. "They think I knew what he was doing, that I helped him." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my expression calm. "Well, did you?" She shook her head violently, almost too quickly. "No. I mean, not really. I didn't know it would come to this." I nodded slowly, as if trying to understand, but my silence seemed to rattle her even more. She looked away, her hands clenched into fists, her voice cracking. "They're investigating everything, and now my job is on the line. They're talking about suspension. Maybe even worse." Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of her actions finally pressing down on her. She was on the edge, standing on the brink of losing everything, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of realization in her eyes. An understanding of the destruction she'd caused, the lives she'd broken, including her own. There was nothing left for her to say, and nothing more I wanted to hear. She'd made her choices, and now she was paying the price. The next morning, Claire was gone before I woke up. I figured she'd gone to the office to try to salvage what she could, though I doubted there was much left for her to save. She was in over her head, her world collapsing faster than she could try to pick up the pieces. And as for me, I had already decided this was the end. By the time she came home that evening, I'd made sure everything was in place. I'd gone through the house, packing up her belongings and leaving her suitcases by the door. I'd drained our joint accounts that afternoon, securing the finances I'd worked hard for. She'd left me no choice but to think ahead, to make sure I'd be protected. When she walked through the door, she froze at the sight of her things piled in the hallway. She looked at me, confusion and dread mixing on her face. What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I held her gaze, my expression calm but unyielding. "This is what betrayal costs, Claire." She looked down, her face crumpling as the weight of my words hit her. She knew. There was no fighting it, no talking her way out of it this time. Her life, her job, her lover, her home, it was all gone. She'd gambled it away, and now she was facing the consequences. For a long time, she just stood there, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, as if she was trying to muster the words, any words that could make this better. But there was nothing she could say. Finally, she took a shaky breath, picked up her suitcases, and walked out the door. She didn't look back. From the window, I watched her slump onto the curb, staring at the street with that same lost expression she'd had for days, but now there was nothing behind it but emptiness. No secrets, no lies, just the cold reality of what she'd lost. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet satisfaction I hadn't expected. Watching her sit there, alone and broken, was the final closure I needed. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them, stripped of everything she'd once had. And as she sat there, I felt something lift from me, a burden finally released. With that, I turned off the light, letting her disappear into the dark. She'd wanted something else, and now she had nothing at all.